This is a historic day for the Wilberforce School. It's our first ever graduation. And for this special day, we're very honored to have a very special speaker, U.S. Senator Ben Sasse. Senator Sasse is a fifth-generation Nebraskan. Grew up the son of a football and wrestling coach. Went to Harvard, wrestled at Harvard, went to Oxford. Earned a PhD in American history at Yale. Then went into industry and became a turnaround expert, and was called at the age of 37 to be a college president at Midland University, one of the youngest college presidents in the country at the time. And in the space of 5 years, brought that institution from a struggling college to a thriving school. Senator Sasse ran for Senate in 2014 and won by a landslide, and has brought that turnaround mindset to the institution of the Senate. Ben and his wife Melissa have 3 children, and they homeschool as they commute back and forth between Nebraska and Washington. And our school is named after William Wilberforce. And we named our school after William Wilberforce because Wilberforce was a winsome statesman. He was a person of deep Christian faith and conviction, who also was a great rhetorician and great persuasion. And he brought those things to bear on the great issues of his day in England, especially the abolition of the slave trade and slavery. And we in many ways see Senator Sasse as someone who is embodying William Wilberforce's life in the U.S. Congress. So it's a great privilege to have Senator Sasse with us today. And it really says a lot about him as someone who's very in demand as a speaker, that he would be with us here for this special occasion. Thank you, Senator, for being here. We also have a very special, let me just say something real quick about our school. Our school mission is the deliberate integration of faith and learning, of a deep, growing, applied to everyday faith, and rich, rigorous classical learning. With the goal, and our telos as a school, our purpose, our reason for being, is to cultivate not just students who are smarter or better educated, but to cultivate mature adult human beings who are well trained to think independently, rigorously about reality as it is, but also who have been invited up into a life of pursuing virtue and service to God in building His kingdom. That's our purpose. Senator Sasse has a book that just came out last week called The Vanishing American Adult. And when I read it, I realized that the book is about raising American adults who are not just adult children, but who are able to govern themselves in the hopes that they will be able to govern this republic of ours. So I found as I read in the book that Senator Sasse and our school have a common mission. So we have another distinguished guest here with us, Professor Robert George. Professor George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University, sits here at Woodrow Wilson Held. He's also the director and founder of the James Madison Program in American Institutions and Ideals. Professor George has been a fellow on the Supreme Court. He's served in the Council of Foreign Relations. He's been the chairman of the Commission on International Religious Freedom, and many other things, many other books that he's written. The New York Times called Professor George our country's most influential conservative Christian thinker. So we realized that we had here today 2 American thought leaders who are both interested in the restoration of American institutions and ideals, and in particular, those intermediary institutions, family, the school, church, those institutions that are essential for self-government. When we realized we had them both here today, we thought we would invite Professor George to interview Senator Sasse and see that interaction happen, and also then later invite you all to ask some questions at a certain point. So let me actually end with a quote from the book that is Senator Sasse is framing up how to think about educating and raising children. He says it this way: envision yourself as a nanny tutor to a princess who will one day take the throne, or Alexander. Or plot your plan of attack if you were simply a parent raising a future ruler. Because you are. This is actually you. If you are now or will one day be an American parent, or I might add, an American teacher, then you have this high calling to raise a ruler. For in America, the people rule, and thus our people need to be fit to rule. Not just some class of elites, but all of us. So with that, I'll invite Professor George and Senator Sasse.
Thanks a lot. Well done. Robert. It's been a while.
So I want to say how delighted I am to be here, and especially for the invitation to have a conversation with Senator Sasse. I'm a Ben Sasse guy. So this is exciting for me, and yesterday I had the pleasure of spending some of the afternoon with Senator Sasse and his wonderful family, Melissa, his wife, and Corey, Alex, and Breck, his kids. And he's raising future rulers, just as Hal said. I wanted to begin the conversation, which will turn to some issues in the book that Senator Sasse now has out, The Vanishing American Adult, subtitled Our Coming of Age Crisis and How to Rebuild a Culture of Self-Sacrifice. But I do want to begin with that quotation that you read, because it reminds us that our founders, the folks who gave us a republic if we can keep it, understood their work, understood what they were doing as an experiment in ordered liberty, an experiment in Republican government. Why was it an experiment? It was because it had never successfully been done before. There had been republics in the ancient world, in the Renaissance city-states and so forth, but they had always failed, leading many people, perhaps most people, to believe that they failed because they had to fail, because human beings could not govern themselves. Republican government was not the kind of government fit for creatures like human beings, that the fate of mankind would be to be under authoritarian rulers. Sometimes benign, ideally benign despots, but despotism of some sort. Our founders didn't know that this experiment would work, and they worked hard to craft a constitution with a system of government, a system of checks and balances, that would perhaps enable the experiment finally to work. And it's done pretty well. We've had our ups and downs. We've been torn apart by a civil war. We have failed to live up to our constitutional principles, the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. We have compromised. There's a lot of sins in our past. And yet, we have been a beacon of hope and a beacon of freedom, an example of Republican government working. But our founders would be the first to say, Ben, if they were here, that the experiment is never over. Republican government can always fail, and it can fail for the reasons articulated in the 10th Federalist paper by James Madison. It always requires a people prepared to govern themselves. And to be able to govern themselves as citizens, to be Republican citizens, people need certain virtues, personal virtues. In fact, above all, they need to be able to govern their own passions. They need to be able to rule themselves. They need to be able to be adults. What's the difference between an adult and a child? A child requires supervision, authority, parental authority, the authority of the pastor, the authority of the teacher. The adult is meant to be an authority to himself, not the only authority, not the ultimate authority, but able to govern himself, to govern his own passions, his own desires, to put them under the control of reason, of conscience, of the principles of his faith. And yet, for some of the reasons that Senator Sasse articulates in the book, and for other reasons, we seem to be losing that. And before inviting Senator Sasse to say a word about this, I'll just conclude these brief opening remarks by saying that our founders were keenly aware that the Constitution that they crafted in the hope of making the Republican experiment finally work was one that they themselves knew could not be sustained without virtue in the people. They didn't think they could substitute for a lack of virtue machinery, institutions, even constitutional structures that would make Republican government work. Yes, we need those structures. Yes, we need those institutions. Yes, we need the checks and balances. Yes, we need separation of powers. Yes, we need federalism. Brilliant ideas, terribly important, necessary. But even the best institutions and structures of the world will not be able to preserve freedom and self-government where the people lack virtue. And this is why Washington made such a big deal out of religion and morality in his farewell address. It's why Adams, John Adams, the finest, the best political philosopher of the founding generation, he doesn't get the credit he deserves because, as he himself said, he was obnoxious and short. Jefferson is usually credited with being the finest political theorist of the group. He was very good. Adams was the best. And Adams said, our Constitution is designed for a moral and religious people and will serve well no other kind of people. They understood that while we could, to quote the language of the Federalist Papers, Ben, supply in the Constitution to some extent the defect of better motives, we couldn't do without the better motives altogether, without the virtue altogether. So here we are. It's our turn. It's our generation. We now have the experiment in our hands. And the question is, will it succeed? Madison said only a well-educated people can permanently be a free people. And what the Wilberforce School is doing, and what schools modeled on its principles all around the country are doing, is trying to provide that well-educated people that can sustain freedom and Republican government. So I congratulate you. I applaud everyone who's involved in supporting the school, and God bless your efforts. Ben, over to you.
Well, first of all, Hal, thanks for not just the introduction, but the chance to be here today, because I'm a Robbie George guy. So not to make this too much of a love-in, but frankly, I would prefer to be the one doing the interviewing. The New York Times piece you quoted, naming him the most influential conservative thinker in America, is undoubtedly correct, and I'm a student of Professor George's, even though I've only gotten the chance to speak with him in person a handful of times, and it's why coming this weekend and spending a lot of yesterday afternoon with you was such a delight. So let me also echo the comments of congratulations and gratitude to all of you who've been a part of building this school. I am prohibited, based on a whole bunch of Senate ethics rules, from soliciting funds on behalf of other people, but I am properly lawyered up to know that I'm allowed to thank people on behalf of other people. So on behalf of the Wilberforce founding generation and current board and faculty and administration that get to be a part of something bigger than themselves, for those of you who are writing checks to make this possible, thanks a lot for what you're investing in. This is a special institution, and I won't say it here, but I may offer a brief word of thanks and congratulations when I speak at commencement, to say Tocqueville would recognize this sort of assembly. This is a quintessentially American kind of event. So thank you for what you're investing in. I'll just underscore one thing Robbie said and maybe layer on a little bit of economic history as well. The first thing that I'll underscore is that distinction between childhood and adulthood, a distinction between a dependent state of little kids who can't feed themselves, won't get inside before the foxes and the wolves are out at night, can't restrain their passions, don't know enough about the telos, about where they should be headed. That's a dependent state, and there's a lot about it that's beautiful. Right? There are pictures of all sorts of things which are eschatological in that state of dependence and not being self-sufficient. And yet, it's a temporary period, and where you want to get is to adulthood. You want to get to that state of independence where you're pursuing the good, the true, and the beautiful, and seeking to live a life of gratitude to God by making yourself useful to live out your life to serve your neighbors. And the transition from childhood to adulthood requires an awareness of the fact that you're going to need to sort of take the training wheels off at some point. I think one of the things I was thinking about as I was working on this book project is I had never really reflected in any deliberate way on adolescence. It turns out the concept is only about 2 millennia old, that you hit puberty, you become biologically an adult. Again, most places that are not war-torn or living in abject poverty for the last 2 millennia, we've had this idea that there's this kind of greenhouse phase, 18 months maybe 4 years, but your body becomes an adult, and we don't assume you have to be immediately independent financially, emotionally, morally, school leaving, household structure-wise. There's this sort of greenhouse phase where we transition. That's really a great gift. Like, I'm not an opponent of adolescence. I've become a celebrant of adolescence as long as you know that it's a means to an end. The really horrible thing is if you take what should be the gift of adolescence and you start to think it might be the end instead of a means, and you get stranded in Neverland. And I think that's what we're doing right now. We're stranding a lot of our kids in Neverland, and I use that term on purpose because Peter Pan is a dystopian hell. Disney has tried to remake it as if it's utopian. Peter Pan is a really horrible character, right? This guy's biologically an adult. He's killing people, and he has no moral sense or historical memory. He can't remember the names of the people that he kills. It's a terrible thing. And right now, I think we're stranding a lot of our kids in Neverland, and the one economic history point I'll overlay all of the great sort of theological anthropology and political theory, and how awesome to have a title. Your position is jurisprudence. What a great office to hold. I'll add a tiny bit of economic history, which is to say we live at a really unique moment in human history, and the historian in me knows that usually you're supposed to be skeptical of anyone claiming that something's unique, because usually the historian's job is to be a skunk at the garden party. Actually, there's much more continuity here than discontinuity is usually our job. But we live at a time where we're transitioning from what I think of as the third stage of economic history to the fourth stage, and we don't know what to call this thing. We had hunter-gatherers, we had nomads, we had agrarianism and the rise of the sort of Tocquevillian New England village, Princeton 3 centuries ago. You had industrialization, urbanization, mass immigration, countryside to city and across the oceans. And now we have this new thing, the mobile economy, the digital economy, the IT economy. Sociologists have thrown in the towel. They now just call it the post-industrial economy, which is a way of saying we don't know what it is, right? It's the after the last thing stage. We don't refer to industrialization as the de-agriculturalization economy, right? It's not post-agriculture, it's industrialization because we know what it became. We don't know what this thing is. And when you don't know what you're headed toward, you have lots of angst and fear. It's understandable that our neighbors do. And it isn't just about economics, though the shrinking of the average duration of a job creates all these echo problems, I think, in social networks and human capital. And so we live at a time where neighborliness is in decline, and therefore we've got lots of fear about what will it look like if you're 40 and 45 and 50, and I'll stop here. But you lose your job in the middle of your life, and you're gonna have to get one again. That's new. That's never really had to happen in human history before. Bill Gates refers to this as the first intra-generational economic revolution. All past ones have been intergenerational. 55-year-old farmers didn't leave the farm and move to the city in 1890. They recognized that their kids would have to, as they became 15 and 20, leave the farm and move to the city. That's intergenerational. This is intra-generational, and that disruption means that we don't really know what it looks like to become an adult economically and in terms of economic, financial self-sufficiency, job durability. And so it means that a lot of us recognize there's this kind of tweener stage that lots of adults are going to live in, and so we just kind of throw up our hands and let our kids drift such that we can't tell 10 and 15 and 20 and 25-year-olds apart. It's a bad thing for a republic.
One of the things, Senator, in the book that really struck me was pointing out that in the world we're now in, our young people are going to have a number of careers, not just have a number of jobs. We know about having a number of jobs. It could be just rising through the ranks at one firm. But what you observe is that people are going to have a number of careers, because the careers they begin in will no longer be viable. And the next career won't, after a certain amount of time, won't be viable in the third. And that's scary. Not just for the people, perhaps especially for the people who are young people today who are facing that, but even for people like myself who wish the world well, wish the country well, wish our young people well, and worry about how does that actually get managed, both at the micro level of the individuals and families who are affected, and at the macro level. How does American politics, American government, and American culture enable that to be something human as opposed to something inhumane? You can imagine a very bad, inhumane version of that. Can we realistically hope for the humane version?
We absolutely can hope for it, and yet as we try to figure out how to build that, we don't have a very good map right now of how to think about this problem, right? This book is not at all about politics. It is 0% about politics. I mean, in the classical Greek sense of politics, it's about politics because it's about the community, but it's not at all about compulsory politics, and it's 99% not about policy, so don't mishear what I'm going to say next.
There's even a chapter explaining why it's not about politics. But you have to get almost to the end to get that explanation.
It's a postscript. So don't mishear what I'm going to say next, because I'm not talking about healthcare and health policy as a way to get anywhere near partisan politics. It's the Lord's Day, and we can all be free of that. But I will say that one of the strange things about our health policy debates is that it's like we don't even have the categories of recognizing what it's going to look like, that people are going to be disrupted out of employment more rapidly in the future. The number one driver of uninsurance in America today, by far, is job change. And yet we still talk about health financing and health insurance and health security and health worries that people have, primarily in terms of socioeconomic status or health status, pre-existing medical conditions. And yet overwhelmingly what drives uninsurance is that we just change jobs more rapidly than before, and the vast majority of Americans, about 165 million out of 320 million of us, and so lots of the people that are in that remaining delta, the last 155, are over 65, so they're already on Medicare and government programs. Most of our folks are insured through employer-sponsored plans, and yet we change jobs now just under every 4 years. And when you change jobs, on average, you're uninsured for 4 to 6 months. Well, that's when you get the breast cancer diagnosis, that's when you have the car accident, and that's when you create the pre-existing conditions population of 5 and 10 and 15 years from now. The pre-existing conditions population in America today is only about 3.5% of the public, so 10 million people. We could solve that problem. There are a whole bunch of different ways you could solve that. The problem is we can't solve 50 or 75 newly pre-existing condition uninsurable folks for a decade or 2 decades from now. And we don't even talk about that stuff the right way. And a huge part of that is the echo of what Robbie's talking about, that isn't just individuals becoming unemployed when they're 40 or 45 or 50, but it's all of the remaining sort of social stability that echoes that, and frankly, more fundamentally, the work identity anchor that drives the fact that when you work, it isn't just about putting bread on the table. It's a huge part of who we are. We're made to work.
And changing that is a tough thing to do. It's not just changing jobs, it's changing at a certain level who you are, your self-understanding.
And how to think of ourselves as having plural vocations. It's nice to sit in 2017 and have the echo of the Reformation 500 years ago this year. It gives us a whole bunch of reasons to go back, and we can wrestle about doctrine of justification. We can also just talk about the recovery of a doctrine of vocation, that Latin term that all of your students at a place like this surely know, but vox, the voice of God calling us to things. It isn't just the one thing that you get your primary check from. It's all the other callings we have. It's when our mom declines and we all of a sudden need to start figuring out how to change diapers again, but this time it's not our kids, it's the generation that brought us up. That's icky, and yet that's a calling.
Senator, you're probably accustomed to being frequently asked questions that begin, as an American, what would you do or say or think? I want to ask you the question as a Christian. What would you do or say or think? And here's the question. It's just a fact that most of the elite institutions of our society, journalism, the professions, the professoriate, economic institutions, down the line, in most of those institutions, the overwhelmingly predominant governing philosophy is one form or another of liberal secularism or secular humanism or secular progressivism. That's just a fact. Princeton University, I dare say Princeton Theological Seminary, there can be a Christian overlay and all that. But that, I think, is just a fact. Now, how do we as Christians deal with that reality as we try to fulfill our obligations as citizens, to be the very best of citizens, even in this world, which is not our home, but still, as resident aliens, as temporary citizens, how do we fulfill our obligation to justice and the common good when the institutions are no longer shaped by a Judeo-Christian ethic? And to some extent, I would say a very considerable extent, are hostile to that ethic. What's your advice?
Well, I'd probably call Robbie George and ask for advice, is what I would do first. But
talking about your book today, mine.
Let's say that you used some great terms. Let's tease out a few more. Resident alien, temporary citizens, dual citizens, people who believe in a calling to be salt and light, distinguishing what those two roles are. Recognizing that we think of ourselves as both created and redeemed, and when we look at our neighbors, there are a whole bunch of Augustinian categories we can apply as we think about what it means to live next door to these people. One of the things that's echoing a lot in my ears lately is the ninth commandment. Well, I don't want to get into particular early church versus medieval Rome versus
Which
early
ninth commandment
reformers.
do you mean?
Let's talk about not bearing false witness against our neighbors. We live at a strange time where there are a whole bunch of fights that happen in the public square that act like the worst version of the way our kids are 15, 13, and 6. And when I think about 6-year-old fighting, one of the standard things you do is if you think this might be the truth on the issue, on any given issue, and you think someone's over here and therefore you're being mistreated, you rarely argue for this. You think your job is to argue for this. You don't really believe this is true, but you think, well, if I get to this point, I'll already be compromising toward this magnetic pull of this alternate view. And so my job is to argue over here and hope later we'll split the difference. And it's like really dumb used car buying negotiation, right? Where you just name a price that's absolutely absurd. It's really hard work to have enough accountability partners in your life where you have people where you say, I want you to tell me when you think I haven't spoken as truthfully as I possibly can in a given situation, regardless of how somebody else may be disparaging me, right? And I'm not saying this in my particular office, though I'll reflect on that for a minute, but I really do just mean in life in general, all of us in our public office have all of these quasi-tribal identities now where we know that so much public speech is so fundamentally dishonest and there's almost no burden of telling the truth about it. I used to think a long time ago, it really seems incredibly naive, but what if there was a group in America of grassroots folks who just went and protested at the CEO's house of Fortune 500 companies every time they had advertisements that were just insane lies? Right? Just think how dumb it is, most car commercials that we listen to, that you buy this car and you're going to recover your virility and like everything in the world is going to be made right by buying a car that's probably like 2.3% better than the car from 2 years ago. That's the same model. It isn't the new Dodge, it's about change. It's like, it's the new Dodge, it's about forced obsolescence of this product. Right? And the way we do marketing for consumer culture is really similar to the way that most of us act like we should fight for ideas now in the marketplace. And so I think one of the things we have to do is try to get good at because I don't think we have, maybe sort of an intellectualist way to reframe part of your question, and I'm living in the world of pragmatism, so I don't usually get to pause to think about the intellectual way to frame it, is do we have any emerging Christian understanding of political theory in a post-liberal era, right? Because we're entering some weird time right now when 41% of people under age 35 tell pollsters they think the First Amendment is dangerous. That's current polling. 40% of people under age 35 tell pollsters the First Amendment is dangerous because you might use your freedom of speech to say something that would hurt someone else's feelings. Actually, I think that's the point of America. Not to try to hurt somebody else's feelings, but to defend somebody else's right to be wrong. I think that flag burning is abhorrent. And yet I defend flag burning because the alternative to it, in my mind, is a state coming in and trying to police those certain kinds of abhorrent behaviors.
You defend the legal right to flag burning, not flag burning itself.
Thank you. Exactly. I defend, I resist a legal prohibition on flag burning. And that's really hard to explain in a place where I'm from, where old veterans of different wars who want to support me in every other way get really, really angry at me about this. But I try to explain why I think it's really important when I believe certain things about heaven and hell, and I believe certain things about the state's need to stand down when we're talking about life and death issues that are far more important than anything the state can do. I want a big, broad, liberal, classical, ACLU archives are right down the street, right? I want a lot more 1945 version of ACLU folks. You know, J. Gresham Machen, a guy who obviously had some history at this institution, was the founder of the Philadelphia chapter of the ACLU. That would be very hard for modern Christians to understand today. And yet I think we need to recover a sense of why we want to be civil libertarians, because we want a big group of people who come together, lots of us conceiving of ourselves as minorities, collectively getting to a place where we want a majority defense of the right to be wrong, and to argue with people, and to persuade and to be persuaded. And I think one of the best ways to navigate a world where we don't know what comes next in terms of idealized political theory, and it's always just going to be political theory on the way, this side of the eschaton. We're never going to get to political theory that's redemptive. And yet, beyond the political theory that we think is the idealized thing we want to fight for, there's the what will ultimately be the pragmatic outworking of political theory as it exists in our public square in 2030 and in 2040. Well, one of the first things I need to do is be a heck of a lot better neighbor to the people who live one door and one block and 1 mile down from me, at telling the truth about stuff that we argue about in such a way that when I summarize one of my opponent's positions, and I believe this about national politics, and we're sitting in New Jersey, I believe this about Cory Booker, who's a friend of mine, or Bob Menendez, a guy who I respect on a whole bunch of foreign policy questions, but we don't vote the same very often. I want to treat Cory Booker and Bob Menendez as people that if I summarize their position in a debate, or if I summarize one of my neighbor's positions in a dispute about, you know, we live on these sandpit lakes on a big river in Nebraska, and there's a lot of arguments about whether or not boats that have been in other lakes that might have a certain kind of, you know, mussels on them should be allowed in your lake. I want to summarize other people's position in a way that they would say, hey, that was a fair summary of my position. He may not agree with it, but he articulated my position honestly. We don't have a lot of moral community that upholds that as a virtue. The job is always to believe the end justifies the means of disparagement.
Yeah, this is exactly what you say about the civic order, of course, applies to the educational world as well. I aspire to exactly the same thing. In almost all my courses, assign some writing by my colleague Peter Singer, who's at the opposite pole for me on fundamental moral issues, sanctity of human life, marriage and the family, and so forth. But I want my students to understand why someone as intelligent and well-motivated as Professor Singer comes to views so radically opposed to mine, and that does require me to present his views not only accurately, but in the most sympathetic possible light. Now, I've got a critique, which I also share with my students, but I think it's really important to do that. Fundamental fairness, the educational mission itself requires that we do that, and what you say about the civic order is the same. There are these two guys. One's a guy I respect very much, whose name is Rod Dreher, and the other guy happens to be me. And these two guys are giving what I think is contrary advice to the Christian community. Rod is proposing what he calls the Benedict Option. In the face of the challenge that I articulated a moment ago, with so many of the institutions of our society now basically governed by a secular progressive ideology, In many cases, even those that are formally Christian have adopted secular, liberal, ideological positions on life, marriage, religious freedom, and so forth, rather than the historic Christian traditions. And then there's my view that this is no time for retreat, quite the opposite, that we should be redoubling our efforts in the public square to bring our testimony to what we believe to the public square, and to really try as best we can to advance the common good as we ourselves understand it in light of our fundamental principles, that we should be fighting for human rights, like the rights of the unborn child. We should be fighting for marriage and the family, no matter how bleak it looks. My view is that in the end, we don't determine whether we get the victory or when we get the victory or how we get the victory. That's up to God. Our job is to be faithful, and it's to be out there bearing witness and doing our best to protect the innocent, doing our best to protect the fundamental institutions without which people will not flourish as human beings. Now, I'm here and Rod's not, but I want you to feel completely free to say he's right and I'm wrong, or to articulate some third position. How do you see it when the question is, should we choose the Benedict option, which doesn't mean completely retreating from the world, but it does mean taking some time, protecting the integrity of our own communities by, to some extent, sealing ourselves off a bit? Or am I right to say we need to be redoubling our efforts in the public square? Is there some third position?
What a great frame. So first of all, that's a debate I'd like to see. I'd enjoy being in the audience for that debate. But then, if I could reframe it a little bit and say, now let's have the same debate again, but only talk about 25-year-olds, and then have the same debate again and only talk about 5-year-olds. And my guess is, though I'm on the Robbie George end of this continuum, I'm completely on your side of the continuum for adults, and I'm at maybe more of a hybridized position for children. And so I think what I think is, as somebody who has named, my wife and I have named our kids things that flow from the Augustinian and Reformation traditions. So one of our kids is named Augustine, pretty theologically heavy for a 6-year-old.
It's the kid I mentioned who goes by Breck.
We call him Breck, who is Augustine Breckenridge Warfield Sasse. Breckenridge Warfield comes from a place at this institution, not anything about, sort of his origins at a ski place in Colorado. Breck is a kid who we want to raise to understand the two cities and the two loves, and to aspire for reconciliation of these cities in a city that has foundations and where authority is no longer divided between the age that is yet to come and the authorities of this age. But the authorities of this age are to restrain evil, and they're to provide for the common good at a time when the king is not yet reigning in every way in every institution. And so I aspire to have my kid understand those differences and to live among his neighbors in this world. But that's what I aspire for him once he's mature. And he's not yet there. And so I think when I listen to Rod, there are things that I disagree with Rod about in the current book, The Benedictine Option, when I've heard him talk about it. And then I hear other people critiquing him, not you, Professor George, but other people critiquing him. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's not a fair summary of what he's saying. That he's not proposing some sort of true radical separatism. He's saying, are you sure you have enough safe space, a word I'm usually pretty critical of, but do you have enough safe space for a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old? Because I'm not ready to hand my kids over to the world yet. And frankly, our 13 and 15-year-old, we're wrestling with this stage of their life where they're ready to get going and do more stuff in the world. And we're like, yeah, we actually want to still protect you a little bit from certain things in the world. And we conceive of parenting, not just teenagers, but near teenagers. We talk about it at our house as training wheels removal exercises. It's a metaphor we use in this book a lot. Training wheels, I'm actually a no training wheels guy. I trained all my kids to ride a bike by just putting them on a bike on a slight declining road and then put a helmet on them and a whole bunch of snowsuits, and I ran behind them. And I've trained my 3 kids and a bunch of neighbor kids the same way. I bat them shoulder to shoulder as they're falling down this hill, and eventually they just catch. And and they have balance, and they all of a sudden learn how to ride a bike. You can train them in 2 hours as long as you're willing to get a few stitches, both theirs and yours, straddling the back wheel. But anyway, just pretend for a minute I was a training wheels guy. The purpose of training wheels is a means to an end, right? You want to take them off so they can ride the bike next to you. That's what you aspire to. And we have to deliberate as a matter of prudence. At what stage are our kids ready to ride the bike off on their own? And I think what Rod at his best means, though I am on your side of this debate, but when I try to put the best spin on his argument, I think what he's really saying is, don't just assume that there's enough shared moral consensus in your neighborhood to just let all authorities speak to your kid like they're equally authorities in their life.
About that, he is plainly correct. And that's why what Wilberforce is doing and what schools like Wilberforce are doing all around the country is so important. I don't like the concept of safe spaces either, but we can use it sort of analogically to say that what Wilberforce does provide is a safe space for the nurturing of young Christians and anybody else who would like to avail themselves of this type of education to grow. To the point that they are able to go out and take on the world. How's it time to turn things over and have a little Q&A with the audience?
So raise your hand and you guys
Thanks.
call on. Don't be bashful.
Yes, sir.
One of the things that I've always appreciated about being an American is a suspicion of aggregations of power. And the founders clearly wrestled with that, and I think that was part of their theological upbringing. We seem to have focused well on aggregations of political power, but not so much on aggregations of economic power. And things have changed remarkably. I'm interested in the Senator's assessment of why it is that, and I carry the Republican banner, so I'm sympathetic with what you're doing, but I'm concerned about Republicans advocating for those who would turn us all into commodities.
Yeah, I share that concern. I think that our political discourse right now is really impoverished, and the vast majority of people's positions on the vast majority of issues are mostly trying to figure out what to be against first instead of what to be for. And so if you're a Republican and you think that you're supposed to be against big government, you're supposed to be against Democrats who seem to be for big government and critical of big business, well then maybe the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's how most people's political positions are held right now. Russia's a perfect example. Putin is a disastrously bad guy. Opponent of free speech, free assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, all sorts of stuff he's doing. Republicans have gone from very skeptical of Putin in 2012, 13, and 14 polling to about 80% of Republicans now quasi-sympathetic to Putin. Totally bizarre to me, except that the Democrats are really anti-Putin, so a whole bunch of Republican voters have decided, well, then they should be for him if Democrats are against him. There are a whole bunch of American things which should supersede the legislative fights between Republican and Democrat. And so I think there's also some polling that shows that when you ask the American people, are you more aligned with the Republican or the Democratic Party, you don't give them a choice of none of the above. 46% of the public interrupts to say none of the above. It's 29% Democrat, 25% Republican, and my side, don't mean to presume on all your politics, the Republican side is much older demographically, so this is not a future you want, a party with 25% support and aging out, and 46% other. And even though only 54% will answer the question, when you ask them why they're a Republican or a Democrat, almost 70% of that 54% that will answer starts by telling you what's wrong with the opposite party than what they believe about their own party. So I am skeptical of the consolidation of power in governmental institutions and in terms of economic power structures, but there's not a lot of popular belief in that because each side is mostly looking at what they're against from who the other side seems to be defending. Then I could, if we had longer, and I know we don't, so if we can get another question or two in, I'll just say that I would ultimately explain why I don't think we really have, except in the tech community with the sort of unicorn, the rise of the unicorn app corporations, you don't really have as much consolidation of economic power as it often looks like when you look at the life cycle of how quickly corporations can be competed out by other corporations. So economic consolidation today doesn't scare me as much as it would have in Teddy Roosevelt's time, because these institutions, again, except for the new tech unicorns, which we haven't figured out how to think about from an antitrust standpoint yet, there's so many other types of competitors that can come into play that I don't really think these are durable consolidations of power, so I don't lose a ton of sleep over it. But as a matter of policy, I'd like to debate what's wrong with both. Consolidation on both sides. Thanks.
Next question.
We're so polarized in our society now, and we've talked about that, but what do we do? Is there any way to start moving past that? Practically as a society?
Yeah, I mean, I have an answer here. It's not good news, so I hope this isn't the last question. But I'm one of 5 people in the Senate who's never been a politician before. And before I got there, I really did. This sounds harsh, so please know that if we had lots of time to qualify it, I'd try to add charitable edges wherever possible. But I had a 2x2 matrix. I'm a BCG and McKinsey guy by background. I had a nefariousness and efficacy dimension, and I thought the reason the Congress didn't work well was because it had a lot of outer quadrant players, people who were really, really smart and also pretty darn self-absorbed. The vast majority of overachievers in the world have a kind of peer link problem, that we tend to be much better with the teacher in 2nd grade who we satisfied her or him that we were getting our math homework done on time and getting 100%, and we weren't as good on the playground when you're picking teams, because even if we were good leading a team, so superiors and maybe inferiors structurally in a given moment, like team construction, but peers, bad with peers, because we just don't play well with others, right? My assumption of why the Senate didn't work as an institution has radically changed in the 30 months I've been there. I think we have mostly an opposite quadrant problem. I think the institution of Congress is led by lots of really nice and well-meaning people that you wouldn't hire to lead anything. So I think we have very, very little leadership capacity. We don't have people who can issue scope well, can explain what problem we're trying to solve, build consensus about that, take risks in terms of explaining creative possible solutions, even though it might mean political incumbency risk. The vast majority of people in DC, their biggest long-term thought is their own incumbency, and a lot of them don't have a lot of other job options. And so there's a worry when you're 45, 55, 65 that you don't want to take risky behavior either for your own reelection or to upset the lobbying community, whereas your likely alternate destination. Hardly anybody moves home after they go to DC anymore, right? They either stay forever or they become lobbyists. I think the likely thing that happens to disrupt this moment is ultimately economic near catastrophe, which creates an action-forcing event. I think you're going to have a failed Treasury auction. Not failed, but you're going to have a 15 to 30 basis points jump some Tuesday morning in September when there aren't enough buyers for Treasury bills being refinanced. So we talk about a $19 trillion debt number. The real number of unfunded obligations is more like $70 trillion because we keep all of Medicare primarily, but also Social Security, and interest on the debt is artificially low. We keep all this stuff off book. I mean, it makes Enron accounting look like it was pristine Elliott Ness level honesty. So I think you're going to have a moment where there'll be massive market signals that we need more buyers to refinance US debt. It won't create economic catastrophe then, but it'll create echoes that go for the next 6 to 12 months, which will on net make fall of 2008 look really, really mild. And in that moment, the question is, will there be leadership? I wish that leadership could come from the legislature. I think it's highly unlikely. I think what's going to happen is you're going to need somebody who's president at that moment that can use the bully pulpit effectively, and you hope that that's a sort of benevolent person. We could have big debates about, Lincoln and potential overreach, but you hope it's somebody like Lincoln and not somebody like an Argentinian president. And the odds with the way our politics are going now, the odds are better that it's going to be somebody sort of Argentinian at that moment of power consolidation when you're going to need to do massive entitlement restructuring, as an example. I think it's likely an exogenous event that drives serious reform, not leadership.
Brief comment on it, if I may. I agree that leadership and role modeling are going to be absolutely essential if we're to have any hope of overcoming, especially the kind of hatred, the animus that accompanies the extreme polarization that we're now experiencing. I am about to finish my 32nd wonderful year as a professor here at Princeton. And over all that time, I think the most valuable and enjoyable work I've done is the work I've done with Cornell West. Teaching together, going around the country, lecturing together, doing common projects together. We're as far apart politically, I imagine, as you can possibly be. But we do have some shared values and some shared principles. And even where we don't, our willingness to engage each other in a very public way and try to really learn from each other and to listen to each other, I think is what we need more of. So I just hope more people will do it so that it can be visible to a broader public.
You have 2 grandchildren, soon to be 3rd, who will be attending Wilberforce Academy.
Congrats.
Thank you, no, we're delighted. And one of the wonderful aspects of watching the way the education works is that they're being trained to be intellectually self-reliant. You both articulated a vision of government, which obviously is one which is in favor of self-reliance. When you sit with your colleagues in the Senate or in the House, on the Democrat side, do any of them have any recognition of the culture of dependency that government at all levels today seems to be fostering, and the real challenge that has to the nature of the social fabric of the United States?
I want to be real cautious here, just partly because we're concluding on this, and partly because it's a Sunday afternoon. So I don't want to be making partisan comments. But I would say that Nebraska Democratic voters have that worry. I don't think national Democratic politicians have that worry very much. And I think some of it is sociological. If you have read Charles Murray's bubble quiz results, and for folks who haven't, I'd highly recommend it. In my experience, I've paid taxes in 12 or 13 states in my 23 years of marriage. My wife and I have popped around because of strategy and crisis and turnaround work I've done. So I've lived a lot of places, and I've worked with people that are all across the political spectrum and been a conservative myself through that whole process. And I really genuinely believe, by my anecdotal experience, that in city after city after city in America, Charles Murray's data is borne out, that people who are on the conservative end of the political spectrum are far more likely to know people who have different views than elite Democrats are. Elite Democrats tend to have very, very bubbled experiences. And again, Charles has some data on this, which is kind of amazing, that in terms of the broad range of American experience that exists out there, racially, geographically, socioeconomically, religiously, theologically, worldview-wise, certain neighborhoods in Manhattan and San Francisco are the most sheltered people that exist. They don't know anybody who doesn't have the experience they have. I mean, it's a very common thing for elite Democrats to say, well, how could it possibly be the case that Donald Trump is going to be elected president? I don't know anyone who's going to vote for him. Well, lots of us, election after election after election, who've lived in other places in the country, I know lots of people on every side of every election I've ever been around, and I like and respect those people. I'd like to just underscore Robbie's point about what he and Cornell West do, too. It's amazing stuff, and we need a lot more things that look like that in the world. This is a new problem for the Democratic Party. The old labor union Democratic Party didn't have this siloed existence. When you go from 1935 to 1965, we're getting the hook, FDR was managing a crisis, and he was worried about creating perpetual dependence, permanent dependency. LBJ, an incredibly smart but much more Machiavellian character, was well aware of what he was building and wanted to build dependence. Right? Other people in the
I will have them voting for me for the Democrats for generations, famously.
And in private, LBJ had a strategy of creating dependence. And lots of Democrats used to be able to understand that as a strategy and argue about the morality of it. Many others now are just being raised in a world where that is the sort of coalition interest group politics, and you're trying to figure out how to dole it out. The Republican Party, I used to believe, I'll stop here, I used to believe the Republican Party had lots of ideas and we had lots of vibrant debate, and it was the Democratic Party, despite having elite branding, that didn't have a lot of ideas in their party. Now I don't think either party has any ideas. So I think we live at a time when these parties are ripe for either reform or collapse.
Very quickly, I've been on both sides. I grew up in West Virginia. Not only did we not like Republicans, we didn't know any. It was a democratic monoculture. I'll admit in front of Senator Sasse, I was governor of the West Virginia Democratic Youth Conference not only once but twice. I was a Carter alternate delegate to the 76th convention. But what led me out of the Democratic Party were two things. One, the party's embrace of the cultural left-wing agenda, beginning with abortion and then sexuality and marriage and so forth, and seeing in West Virginia the culture of dependency that was created by the Johnson Great Society programs. These are the people I knew and loved, in some cases my own relatives, who were falling into the trap. And that's what persuaded me that this is not the way to go.
Thank you.
Well, we tell our teachers that if they're doing a good job, they'll sometimes run over the bell. And you all to Senator Sasse, William Wilberforce had Josiah Wedgwood commission him to make plates that he would use at dinner parties. And when you got finished with your food, you would discover a kneeling slave or a galley of a slave ship that would demonstrate the issue of slavery to the guests. We had a replica made, and we'd like to give this to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.